Chris, let me ask you this. From year to year, and I know Georgia lost a game last year, but I looked at Georgia as an elite team. There have been Alabama national championship teams where I looked at them in the middle of the season and I said, they're an elite team. Is there's going to be a national champion this year, but is there an elite team that is far better than everybody else? Or is Georgia just a little bit better than everybody else?
A little bit better than everybody else, although, to your point, there's not an elite team, and I don't think there's what I would call the normal close to elite challengers. So, I don't think Georgia's as good as last year's Georgia team, but they're not playing last year's Georgia team. Are they the best team this year? They're the most complete. Speaking of teams that have talent but are not playing well and playing down to their competition like Georgia has, Ohio State's done that all year long, quite a bit. Now, this week, I don't put much into it because 35-mile-an-hour winds with gusts of 50, nobody's throwing it very well. But they did give up defensively a lot of rush yards to Northwestern. So they're just, I don't know about turning it on, but talent-wise, they can play. They can throw it, and I don't think they're as good as Georgia defensively. I think Georgia wins. Michigan is a more physical team. They're not as good at throwing it as, say, Ohio State, but they're really, really good. I think TCU is Tennessee. I mean, they're so close. Great quarterback that's playing great receivers. The difference is they played every team they played pretty good because it's balanced, and they're coming from behind in games, but they're finding ways to win. But I think TCU is good. I don't think like if TCU played Georgia, I think they get the same type of result as we saw with Tennessee beating Georgia. But familiarity too, Georgia with Tennessee, personnel wise, with not as much familiarity with TCU, might change that a little bit, and TCU might have a little bit more success offensively. But look, here's what makes Georgia really, really good. Again, offensive line very good. They can run the football downhill with good backs. Maybe not as great as some of the backs that they've had. A quarterback that's just good. Everybody makes fun of him and all of that. But you know what? When things broke down on the first score, who ran out, made a play, and got a touchdown early? Stetson Bennett makes plays, and you know what he does? He makes the biggest plays in the biggest games. And he has a really good, because look at that game-winning drive against Alabama. He's done a lot of things that probably doesn't get credit for, and he has a lot of talent around him. It's a different style. Most teams in the spread RPO system, Georgia's still a play-action-based team. They run the football downhill. They'll throw it deep. They work the tight ends. They don't have great receivers. They've got good ones. And then defensively, they are, when healthy, and they were healthy this past week, they are elite at defensive tackle. Folks, the defensive tackle position affects an offense more than the defensive end. I can scheme away from a good defensive end. I can't scheme away from the defensive tackle who's too close to the ball. And they dominated Tennessee's run game and, didn't have to play numbers, and they could keep their linebackers in good depth. And what did Georgia do? They blitzed the heck out of them. They said, we're not going to let Hendon Hooker have time. We're going to crash the mesh point. We're going to force the ball out, and they did it. And Tennessee had no answer. I broke down the game again early yesterday morning before the NFL game got started. There were Tennessee backs but there was one play in particular that stood out. Looked like the two inside backers were coming, so they had two backs for Tennessee that were in blitz pickup mode. Georgia dropped those linebackers, and those backs' eyes were on the linebackers, and they're like, they're not coming. Meanwhile, the guy coming right across their face, they lost sight of it. They haven't seen that. Blitz pickup, dumping the screen game. Tennessee is a very simplistic offense, very effective. But when you have somebody good enough to say, we're going to blitz you, The blitz didn't work. Well, why didn't everybody blitz them? Because they can't cover like Georgia can. So they've got maximum guys in coverage. Hendon Hooker's got to get the ball out quick. And when he got it over the middle, what do we say about Hendon? Not as accurate there. And when you pressure him and he's a little bit off platform, tight coverage over the middle. And there was nothing to be had over the deep, except for a couple of times. But the throws were rushed and they were overthrown. Not that Hendon doesn't occasionally overthrow a deep ball. I'm not saying that. But it was pressure-induced mistakes. I love Josh, and I know what he said is we were off our game. They were thrown off their game. That's the difference. If you can get the tempo going, this offense is very difficult to stop for most people, but they did it. So the point is, I think Georgia is the most well-rounded. But are they dominant? Can they be beaten? Yes. It has to be a certain type of team. But they've got more answers. They've got more tools in their tool belt.
I guess I'm just going to lay this out here. What's going on in Alabama? What's going on with Alabama? I think a lot of people want to know that. It's going to be the talk of sports radio or whatever. Mm-hmm. All the sports world is going to say, WTF is going on with Alabama.
Yeah.
What do you think?
A few things. Let's state the obvious. Expectations are you don't lose games. You go to the playoffs and you win them. So, but they've lost 2 games on the road, 2 pretty good teams, close games, competitive, could have won them. But there's also the, poor performance against A&M and Texas and wins. So it's not like everything is great and they just lost these 2 games. There's not. Since Nick has got it rolling, this is the biggest hurdle he's had. What I'm seeing, first of all, there's this assumption that Alabama has the best talent. And of course, why do people say that? Because people don't evaluate or know how to evaluate talent. They go and look on the internet and say, oh, they're ranked number 1. They got the most talent. No, that's not always the case. Maybe ranked number 1. That Alabama, let's look at them offensively. Outstanding quarterback talent. Offensive line is not as good as there have been in the past. Not as talented. The receivers, well, first of all, you're not going to have the level of receivers that they've had in the past. But this receiving corps is not good at all. They don't run good routes. They're not where they're supposed to be. Now, a lot of it is they're freelancing a little too much. Tight end, not very good. They've got a really good quarterback and a really good running back. That's all that makes Alabama look like Alabama. Defensively, Dallas Turner, Will Anderson, good edge guys. They don't have a Jonathan Allen, a Quinnen Williams. They don't have those guys, a defensive tackle. Their linebackers, okay. Their secondary, not as good. Georgia, what's happened to Alabama? The new Alabama is Georgia. Georgia looks like Alabama used to look. Georgia's got more talent. Georgia's more physical. I think that's the first thing to understand. 2, I don't think they're particularly well coached in a lot of areas. Some of those things. The other thing, I've mentioned this in relation to some other teams in Tennessee and other. Alabama is not a complete spread team, but they are more of a passing team that was built around the receivers and the quarterback, and they become more finesse blocking, like Ohio State's become more finesse. Georgia is built differently, and I think they play to that. They practice that way. And I think Alabama has become a little more finesse. So when they need to turn around and run the football and control the game and salt the game away if they get a lead, or they're not as good as they used to be. So it's not like it's the world is crumbling. I mean, to the fans, it is, but it's not like it's a disaster. But there are flaws there. There are definite flaws there that it'll be interesting to see how it's corrected. I also looked at something else. So I looked at Georgia's roster Saturday morning, and I went back, and there were 9 starters on Georgia's roster. Really good players. that came down in recruiting to Georgia and Alabama. All 9 of them went to Georgia. Georgia is winning in the right type of recruits. And, also look at this. Jermaine Burton left Georgia. There was a reason. Georgia wasn't disappointed that he left. They got an offensive lineman from Vanderbilt. That was okay. Now, Jahmyr Gibbs is a really good one. And Georgia Tech was he wanted to stay there, but he wanted to go where he could compete. My point is that, Georgia hadn't lost any guys. Now, it may change in the portal and all that. Georgia's better. And I think that if you look at it now, so why are you losing to LSU? Well, because they're making some physical errors and mental errors. So it's partly coaching. Its personnel is not dominant. It's just because you're better. You've got, in the past, they've been so dominant that they'd line up, hand the ball off, and just control the game and win most of the games. They can't do that and impose their will on people as much as they used to. They can do it against some teams, but not against others. And look, they were out-coached by LSU, and they were outplayed by LSU. And LSU played with more discipline. And I don't mean, fighting. I'm talking about more assignment sound. So that in a nutshell, along with a few other things that they're going to have to look at Alabama. And I'll say this in conclusion on it is people would be foolish to give up on Nick Saban and saying that he's done and it's over. Because could I see in the next 3 years him winning another title? I could. But I could also see a scenario where he's won his last title. I think it depends upon, we're getting to the point at 71, and it looks different. It feels different. How he fixes it, can he do it the same? Now, I get this a lot. Well, it's NIL, and the players don't listen. It's not an Alabama issue. That's a college football issue. They're not having as much of a problem with it in other places. So I think there are a lot of question marks, and I do think this is as close to what I was expecting the end to look like than I've ever seen since next year. I'm not saying this is the end. I'm just saying there are more hurdles that have to be overcome for him to fix it. So that's in a nutshell what's going on, and I'm very curious to see how they fix it and how much better they can be. And look, they're still in the elite categories. Only a few programs that can say that they're at that level. Historically dominant, but right now, and not even close, Georgia is the best program in the country last year and this year. Even last year in Alabama winning a game, Georgia, it looks on tape, it looks from a football standpoint, Georgia's the better program right now. And we'll see if Alabama can catch up and surpass them, whatever. But and remember who was such a big factor in a lot of those recruits, particularly in Georgia. And look, the Georgia job is, I don't know if people that don't follow recruiting know this, but, it always was Florida, Texas, California. You're looking at Georgia, the state of Georgia, in terms of quality and quantity, is in the top 5 nationally. And you go to California right now and try to find you an abundance of defensive linemen, you're not going to find them.
Yeah.
But you go into Georgia, and right now, Georgia's the place. It's the program. It's so they've got it going, and that's a difficult challenge that, on top of everything else said, is a bigger challenge, a bigger hurdle for Nick to overcome. I'm not saying he can't do it. I'm just saying it's a bigger hurdle, a taller hurdle, and I'm curious to see how it's going to play out.